Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? So hello, everybody. Welcome to Ask the Grant Writing Experts. I'm Dr. Meg Bouvier. You know me as the creator of your library of NIH grantsmanship courses. I have over 35 years of experience at NIH as an applicant, an intramural researcher, a staff writer, and now as a full-time grant editor and mentor. And I've helped clients land over $500 million in federal funding. I'm here to answer your questions today, so grab a cup of coffee and let's get started. So if you're attending live, a reminder that you're on listen-only mode, and you can type your questions in. If you look at the toolbar, there is a Q&A box, so feel free to just start loading your questions in there. And if you're watching this as a recording, today's date is January 24th, 2024. So everything we say today is true to the best of our knowledge, but things change quickly at NIH. So always verify that what we're saying is accurate. So what you should be viewing in the library right now, well, given the proximity of the February R01 deadline, I would hope that you're not watching courses right now and that you're cleaning up your final submission package and getting it ready to ship off. If you're doing a final systems check, probably the best thing to watch would be checklists to avoid top mistakes. There aren't any big NIH updates right now, except that NIH has a budget. They haven't released the number yet anywhere as of the last time I checked, which was a week or two ago. They were anticipating potential budget cuts, so I'll be very curious to see what happens. And yeah, we'll have to wait and see. Hopefully, people's notice of awards that have been held up will begin to appear in your inboxes. So this week we have a guest, my dear friend, Dr. Burr Zimmerman. Burr and I go back to the very beginning of my career as an NIH grant writer. So this is, we were trying to figure it out earlier. We think it goes back to 2008, which was our first project working together. So that was a time when I was at the tail end of my time as a medical policy writer doing freelance work for NIH after having left the Human Genome Project. And I was just starting out in primarily communications and press work, but I had just started at doing some grant work, and Burr and I were thrown together on a project, and I took an instant like to him. I think he's incredibly skilled and talented as a grant writer. We have since collaborated on more projects than I could ever possibly guess. He's always my first choice to go to when I'm overwhelmed and need help. So Burr, do you want to take it from here and tell people a little bit about yourself and what your topic is today?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And yeah, I can't believe it's been 15 years that we've been working together. And I agree, we've just always been on the same wavelength, which I appreciate so much. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Burr Zimmerman, and today I'm going to be talking about an agency that some of you may not have heard of, and many of you may not have heard of, at least until we had a pandemic. The organization is called BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, and BARDA has a very specialized health mission, which is related to health security. BARDA's mission is around infectious disease and chem, bio, and nuclear threats and antimicrobial resistance, and they focus on developing medical countermeasures, which are products. I'll go into more detail about that, but a little bit about myself. As Meg mentioned, I am also a grant writing consultant, and I founded Urban Venture Group in 2009 to serve a wide variety of customers across agencies, across subject domains, and we've developed a specialization in working with BARDA. And we've raised a little over $1 billion, $1.1 billion in funds for our clients, which is a big number that we're very proud of. And that spans a whole bunch of different awards, from very large multi-year large awards, over $100 million, multiple ones, as well as lots of smaller awards, even $150,000 SBIRs. All right, so BARDA. This audience here for Meg, I trust that you are very familiar with NIH. And BARDA is a very interesting complementary funding source to NIH. BARDA's mission is to aid in securing the United States from public health emergency threats like chemical weapon attacks, biological weapon attacks, radiological, like a dirty bomb, or nuclear threats. More recently, their mission has expanded to include natural emerging threats like pandemic influenza, COVID, and other emerging infectious diseases. BARDA's mission is not primarily basic research or science. They really support the transition of medical countermeasures from the research stage into licensure. So they're trying to get products onto the market that can be used in public health emergencies. And if you're wondering what a medical countermeasure is, or an MCM, it can be a lot of different things: a drug, a therapeutic, a vaccine, a diagnostic tool, or various other medical devices. And just to give you a few examples, sometimes the best way to give people a sense of what BARDA funds is with some examples. So here are 4 projects that BARDA has funded. BARDA provided funding for the Moderna COVID vaccine. And BARDA was founded actually almost a little over 20 years ago in response to anthrax being sent to Congress, you may recall. At that time, the government realized that the military, which had anthrax and other biodefense capabilities, was not necessarily the right organization for civilian threats. So BARDA was created shortly after 9/11 to be a civilian response for these threats. Another project that BARDA funded is Amgen Nplate, which is a radiation for radiation mass casualty events. And then also Avita's RECELL, which helps folks recover from burns. And as you may be aware, radiation attacks also cause significant burns. And so if there were a mass casualty event, there would be a lot of burn patients. So let me talk a little bit about BARDA's origins. As I mentioned, it started a little over 20 years ago. What I want you to see on this slide here is that BARDA has grown and their mission space has grown over the years. BARDA was originally created to incentivize industry to develop medical countermeasures. Since then, their scope has expanded. So they've added CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear agents. They've added other emerging infectious agents. And the way they can fund projects has grown over the years as well. What I want you to see from this is that BARDA is an evolving and growing organization whose mission has been expanding. But they do differ from NIH in some important ways, which I'll go through in just a moment. In terms of funding growth, just over the past few years, their funding has doubled, and they're growing exponentially, not only because their mission has expanded, but because the amount of dollars that they're deploying to address their various requirements are growing. If you look on the bottom left, you can see there was a big bolus of funds in response to COVID, but their baseline funding has been growing each and every year as well. To give you a sense of where BARDA sits within the US government, BARDA is a civilian organization. They're under Health and Human Services. And underneath HHS is the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, or ASPR for short. And then BARDA is underneath ASPR. And there's a few offices that I'm going to talk about underneath ASPR that are related as it relates to a funding pipeline. So BARDA is that's who we're talking about today. BARDA used to manage the Strategic National Stockpile more directly than they do now, but now they partner with the SNS. So BARDA typically not only wants to make sure that a product comes onto the market, but they also want to make sure that it's available when it's needed. So for example, they may want to have some sort of inventory or stockpile of necessary medical countermeasures to be available when needed. And the challenge is some of these, let's say an antidote for a chemical weapon, there's no commercial market for that. There aren't chemical weapon attacks every day where hospitals maintain that inventory. So BARDA and ASPR as a whole maintain strategic stockpiles. And if you receive an award from BARDA to develop a medical countermeasure, that may also lead into either purchases of your products by the government, or on the left, you can see the IBMSC office, Industrial Base Management and Supply Chain. They may actually invest in basic manufacturing capacity to make sure that a wide variety of medical countermeasures and other necessary supplies are available. So underneath ASPR, these are three major areas, BARDA being the topic of today's talk. BARDA, as I mentioned, has a growing mission. Meg, will these slides, will they be available to everyone who's attending today?
We can make them available, yeah, if that's okay with you, sure.
Yeah, definitely. Because I'd like folks to have, like, for example, this slide as a reference to just, remember kind of where everything is within BARDA. I think for people who are interested in receiving funding, let's say you're an NIH funded researcher right now, you're developing some medical countermeasures, some diagnostic technique, or some technology that may be of interest to BARDA. Maybe you have a startup or spin out company. Maybe you might be licensing your intellectual property for a therapeutic to a larger pharmaceutical company. If you're potentially a funding recipient for BARDA, the left column is the first area where I would suggest you look. Think about if your medical countermeasure is most appropriately for CBRN or IEID or DDDI, and then you would engage with those programs directly. Some of these other bubbles that are on this chart in the center and on the right are support organizations whom BARDA would engage as a part of talking with you through the programs on the left. This graphic, which I like, came directly from BARDA's website. I take no credit for it, but I do encourage you to go look at that on their website. And a few of these bars here, I'm gonna zoom in on a little bit. So as I mentioned, there's funding programs and what I call them funding programs and support programs. BARDA may not agree fully with those definitions, but there's a few terminologies that I think are really important for you to understand as you engage with BARDA. So first is CBRN and Project BioShield. Project BioShield is a source of funding that BARDA has. It's an act of Congress. And they use Project BioShield funds to support acquisition of medical countermeasures for CBRN threats. DDDI is another acronym, Detection, Diagnostics, and Devices. If you're developing a diagnostic tool or a detection tool or some sort of medical device, most of them go through DDDI, although there are some loose boundaries in some cases. IEID, which is influenza and emerging infectious diseases. And then NextGen, that's a new program. It is a collaboration with NIAID, so NIH's Allergies and Infectious Diseases Division. It collaborates with BARDA for NextGen for COVID-19 response. And then last is PPI, Pharmaceutical Countermeasures and Infrastructure. So these are the funding programs in BARDA that are most of interest. And then when you start working under a project under BARDA, you'll start to engage with BARDA's expertise in some of these support areas, such as regulatory, quality affairs, clinical development, non-clinical, and contract. In addition to those funding areas, BARDA has what they call innovation programs. These are a little bit earlier stage. An ideal readiness level for these programs might be what's called, if you're familiar with technology readiness level, TRL 4 or 5. That means you've entered the clinic. If you're preclinical, you're often a little bit early stage for BARDA's preference. However, they do have the DRIVE initiative, which can support earlier stage ventures, and DRIVE includes several different types of programs. There's some smaller direct funding projects. There's an accelerator network, which can support startups. BARDA Ventures can make direct investments into startups. Redirect can work with existing pharmaceutical companies to identify public health applications for existing therapeutics that have been approved in other areas. And then there's also Carbex, which focuses on antibiotic resistance, and Blue Knight, which is actually a joint venture between BARDA and Johnson & Johnson. So J Labs is the very famous Johnson & Johnson accelerator program. Blue Knight is a collaboration between BARDA and J Labs. All right, those were some of the areas in BARDA that I think are important for folks to know. We just have a few minutes left of the program. I do want to spend a little bit of time differentiating NIH and BARDA. And first of all, well, NIH and NSF from BARDA. So first of all, BARDA, their funding supports BARDA's requirements. It is fundamentally not peer review driven. BARDA has a set of requirements. We need to develop countermeasures for these threats, and they go out and seek funding or seek applicants, seek recipients of funding to meet those requirements. And so your proposals should focus on agency needs, not exclusively scientific merit the way you might for NSF or NIH. So make sure you really deeply understand BARDA's mission. The selection decisions are programmatic. And by that, I mean program staff are really making those funding decisions. Now, they're informed by expert review, but it's fundamentally different than peer review. Their priorities come internally rather than from a team of scientists determining them. And lastly, BARDA's end goal really is regulatory approval of new products. And so, regulatory approval is really a key endpoint to propose to them. So if you kind of look at funding levels and level of maturity, NIH can offer actually quite bigger awards, even much beyond $3 million. BARDA awards can be huge. In fact, we've been a part of multiple 9-figure awards, over $100 million. And BARDA funds big work with big goals. And as you may be aware, late-stage clinical development can be challenging. And when you're talking about threats that don't occur normally, if you're testing a drug against a nerve agent, you don't have patients enrolling who have been attacked by nerve agents regularly. So it's much more challenging to take that through FDA approval. So if you can see the little graphic at the bottom, BARDA's focus is product development, whereas NIH's focus is fundamental research and applied research, and just sort of touching on product development. But what is convenient is this creates a funding pipeline. So if you are developing a medical countermeasure, you might start your research with NIH, and then when you get into product development maturity, you can transition to BARDA. And then as the product matures and gets approved, you may get acquisition and other resources from ASPR. So if maybe this might be the most important slide here, which is where does BARDA fit into your development pipeline? And the answer is once you transition, into IND and clinical evaluation, that's BARDA's sweet spot. There can be places where they get involved earlier, but this transition, I think, is a good general rule of thumb. There are 2 specific funding opportunities I want to call your attention to. BARDA has a BAA, or Broad Agency Announcement, and they also have an easy BAA from DRIVE, which is smaller awards. These BAAs list all their topics of interest. And the way you validate if your project is of interest to BARDA is by engaging with them. There are meetings and events where you can attend. In particular, BARDA Industry Days in the fall is highly recommended. BARDA has a wonderful program called TechWatch where you can request meetings with BARDA. And one of the great things that has happened since the pandemic is that BARDA has really integrated with other government agencies. And so when you request a TechWatch, BARDA may show up and invite other agency representatives. Might be from CDC, might be from FDA, might be from DTRA, which is the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and might be other folks too, depending on what your topic area is. So it's a wonderful way to network throughout the government. I do want to set expectations, though. BARDA funding can take longer than you might be used to, say, with an R01. An R01 works on a regular cadence. These proposals are reviewed individually. So they simply review yours on its own and then seek funding to support it. And so between appropriations and obligation and negotiations, award recipients may expect 1 or even 2 or more years from when they first reach out to BARDA until they're funded. It's very common for BARDA to tell you that you are too early stage. Come back when, and then they'll give you directions. So it's very common for them to say, yes, we're interested. You're not ready yet. Once you get to this stage, come back. And so that's why that's a big part of why that longer time frame exists. So to summarize, start off with a tech watch. You can have follow-up calls with BARDA. They're called market research calls. That's their terminology. And then you submit a quote-unquote white paper. It's called the market research abstract. That's like a pre-proposal. It's 14 pages. It gets reviewed, and they'll either encourage you or not to submit a full proposal. BARDA full proposals are enormous. They are extremely detailed, lengthy, challenging. For those of you who are used to writing R01s, these are much harder than that. If you have maybe written to a contract solicitation for NIH, it's more in that vein, but even more than that. So very challenging process. But, you know, if you're requesting 50, 75, $100 million, obviously the government needs to protect that investment. I wanted to revisit a comment I made a moment ago. Each full proposal is reviewed as an independent submission. And that's important because it means BARDA might fund something, they might not, they might fund more than one. There's no requirement that they fund anything when you submit that proposal. Furthermore, contract negotiations can be very involved. It's unlike, you might have a just-in-time request for NIH. With BARDA, they might send you multiple rounds of extensive technical questions. They're going to inquire about the science, the clinical data, your statement of work or SOW, your budget. It's very involved. So just because you get that invitation to negotiate does not necessarily mean you're a shoo-in. One of the key things that they will negotiate with you is what's called a target product profile, or TPP. The TPP is a document that encompasses the desired characteristics of your medical countermeasure, and that gets attached to your contract. So as I mentioned, BARDA is very interested in products being approved. And it's not just that any product gets approved, it's that a product with very specific and critical characteristics gets approved. And so what I'm trying to convey to you is that BARDA will be very involved from start to finish in making sure that the device that gets developed, or therapeutic, et cetera, really meets their needs. And it's very possible that you might propose one set of performance characteristics, and BARDA might come back to you and say, hey, that's great, but we need it to do this. Can you do that? Over and over and over again, BARDA, when we've worked with awards that got funded by BARDA, over and over and over again, they will ask things like, we need you to hit this sensitivity or this selectivity or this cost, or it needs to be for these age ranges. Let's make sure it's useful on infants, not just adolescents, or whatever the case may be. One more key difference between NIH and NSF versus BARDA is they prefer contracts instead of grants. Oh, to be so lucky that you can only work with grants and other financial assistance awards. Those of you who know what I'm saying may be smiling, because the rules are so much more flexible. The outcomes are flexible. It's just a much more safe and comfortable place to live. BARDA contracts are very onerous. They're very specific because they care a great deal about the product that you produce. There's a clear and specific outcome they're looking for. So they do prefer contracts in general, and this is a rule of thumb. There's plenty of instances where other instruments may be appropriate, but if we're thinking about what's another big difference between NIH and BARDA, this is one of them. All right. BARDA remains deeply involved even after you're funded. Oftentimes, when you get funding from NIH, they say, all right, congrats, get going, let us know how it goes, right? They tap you on the head and say, do good science, report back. That is not how BARDA works. BARDA assigns an extensive technical team, could be 8, 10, 15 people, who advise and evaluate your progress. Weekly meetings are the norm. Daily meetings have happened. We had daily meetings during the pandemic for progress of clinical enrollment and adverse events and things like that. BARDA's involvement and level of involvement may be very unlike what you have experienced with either academic or small business grants or with working with other agencies. Now, my opinion is this is because BARDA is committed to their mission and they need to make sure that your work will meet their requirements. And so they're simply ensuring that this product or asset that you're developing stays on track. So I think it's very appropriate that they're this involved, but I don't want you to be in the position of being surprised and caught off guard that that is the case. All right, so you've already seen this slide. If you remember just one thing today, it is that BARDA, it helps prepare America for public health emergencies. Their mission includes infectious diseases, chem, bionuclear threats, and antimicrobial resistance. Their goal is regulatory approval of medical countermeasures for public health emergencies, and in particular, they prioritize late-stage development. BARDA is very collaborative, and that's code for very involved in projects once you receive funds. And they prefer more strict or structured award instruments like FAR-based contracts. With that, we've got about 5 minutes left for questions. And of course, I can stay longer too, Meg. I'll defer to you if you want to go past, but I would love to take some questions.
So as always, Burr, that was incredibly informative and really well organized. And I love that you helped people understand how this fits in with an NIH mindset, you know, how it differs, where it is in the pipeline. I've taken a bunch of notes because I don't typically work with BARDA. So this is really helpful for me. And I love that. I love people thinking outside of the NIH box because I think people are really wedded to the R01 model. And there's, as you know better than I, there is a wealth of federal funding instruments out there that might be appropriate for people that they've never heard of. So it's really nice to get a snapshot of that. So as I said, as Burr said, put questions in the Q&A box. We do have 2 questions about a different mechanism. So while we wait for any other questions, I'm going to answer those and have Burr weigh in if he has more thoughts. The other thing that I want to tell people is that Burr has quite a bit of experience at NIH with SBIR, STTR. So if that's another mechanism that people want to ask about, he's my go-to for that. I actually don't work on those mechanisms anymore because I think Burr is much better at them than I am. So I just send all that traffic to him. So I come into this world from a clinical perspective. My PhD is from a medical school. So Burr and I have really good complementary skill sets, which is in addition to just liking and respecting each other, it's part of the reason we've collaborated a lot. The question is, it's a 2-part question from the same person. We're applying to an R61/R33 mechanism. So this is a phased mechanism for the first time. Any important tips to share? Do you know if we are supposed to be submitting the approach for both phases at the same time in the application, including all human subjects information? So the R61, R33 is highly variable depending on the NOFO, but as with all phased mechanisms, and I know that Burr will back me up on this because we've worked on these together, the trick is there's a go, no-go decision-making point. You have to meet certain criteria in the first phase in order to have the money released for the second phase. So the way you write everything from the aims page to the research strategy has to make it clear what the decision points are for that go, no-go decision point. So the answer is yes, you have to include both phases, but you have to make clear, even on the aims page, which aims pertain to which phase and what criteria you have to meet in order for NIH to give it their blessing and say, yes, you have satisfied the criteria for the first phase, and we are giving you our blessing and money to move on to the next phase. So that's true for all phased mechanisms at NIH. So yes, you have to complete all of that. Burr, do you want to add anything about phased mechanisms?
The only thing I might add is determining what you want your success criteria or go no go criteria to be is really important. And I
Yes.
really try to focus on what is the key feasibility or de-risking activity that justifies going forward. So I think a less preferred route would be to simply put an arbitrary line in the sand at a certain chronological time point. A more preferred approach would be to say, hey, here's the real risk. Let's address that major risk first before we go on with the additional work. And when I say risk, it could be technical question, it could be a feasibility step, it could be a enrollment step. There's lots of things it could be. As Meg said, it depends on the NOFO.
Yeah. And the person is asking, is that criteria the same as the milestones? The answer is yes. So, and then a follow-up question to that pertains specifically to a PEDP. I don't know if people on the call know what this is, but it's cropping up on more and more mechanisms. It's a plan for enhancing diverse perspectives. So clearly this is being asked for in this submission package. You typically see these also in I've seen them crop up in the high risk, high reward mechanisms, the DP mechanisms. So I will say that I have seen applicants handle this in a variety of ways. So, so the person is asking, can you speak to what NIH is looking for? And I can speak to what applicants are submitting, and the fact that I have yet to see a problem arise on a set of summary statements pertaining to the PEDP. So I have not seen reviewers specifically call out an applicant on the PEDP yet. So I wouldn't say that this is like something that's like a big red flag for reviewers, but the way applicants have taken a lot of approaches to handling this in my experience. So I'll ask Burr about his in a moment. But I've seen this be anything from team members who are representative of groups that may be underrepresented in research, the PI may be mentoring people who are underrepresented in research, subjects in research coming from underrepresented groups. I've seen people take various approaches to this. I often have applicants say to me, I really have no idea what I'm supposed to be putting here. So, and I see Burr nodding vigorously. So do you want to weigh in on this as well? This is a little tricky.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. First of all, I've heard some NIH staffers say that, this is a not experimental, but we're trying out what people submit for these PEDPs. And so they're not really judging them harshly yet. So they may not be awarding or not awarding based on your PEDP yet, but they may be in the future. So I think they're gathering data about what is expected and what's reasonable and what applicants are able to do. Many of you who have submitted to NSF know that NSF has had a broader impacts merit criteria since time immemorial, where you talk about broadening participation and encouraging STEM education, encouraging research from underserved communities, research training, et cetera. The advice I like to give is, again, I don't think in terms of you must do or you must not do. I think what is less good is if your enhancing diverse perspectives narrative feels arbitrary or unconnected to your research. And what would be better is if there's some clear relevance. So, for example, if you're working on a health issue or biology that is unique to some group of individuals, there may be a connection there that you can speak to. It doesn't necessarily mean, genetics or biology. It could be people that are in an underserved or low socioeconomic status community may be more affected by a health concern. And so you might enhance diverse perspectives in areas that are relevant to your research in that way. So I try to focus on intentionality and relevance for that PEDP.
Yeah, I agree. I've read some that that sound a little forced, a little contrived. And I think it's better to write less and say something that feels really germane to the project, or at least to you as a researcher and your commitment to mentoring people. I just worked on a DP award where the person didn't really have a lot to say in terms of the research because they were looking at a really fundamental mechanism. It was like an NIGMS type project, a molecular mechanism. But he himself did a lot of mentoring. So he spoke about that, just as his commitment to wanting to welcome diverse perspectives and mentor people from underrepresented groups. And that felt germane. I had not heard what you heard from anybody at NIH, so that's really curious to me, and it would explain why nobody's really getting any comments in the summary statements yet.
That
So
could have been an off the books comment, maybe off the record. Probably, in fact, I'm certain it was.
yeah,
But yeah, and I wanted to go back. The word as you were speaking that came to my mind was sincerity. I think
yeah,
if you have a sincere project or plan, that goes a long way as well. I think that sincerity really can shine through.
yeah, I agree. Well, we are over time, and I see that people have stuck around. So thank you guys so much for sticking around. Burr, it's always a pleasure. I think we have you on the books to come back in the spring sometime. Is that right?
Oh, I believe you.
Yeah, I think I know we're kind of we just show up when our teams tell us to, but
Right, right.
yeah, I think that's the plan. We're always delighted to have you, and let's try to have a virtual lunch soon to catch up. It's been much too long. Always a delight. I always learn a ton from you. So and thank everybody for attending. So we'll see you next time. And as always, best of luck on your NIH grant writing. Have a great day, everybody. Take care. Bye bye, Bert.